Nuclear power has a branding problem. Say the word out loud and most people picture the same two things: a control room flashing red or a mushroom cloud rising over a city. What almost nobody pictures is a squash court. But that's actually where this story begins. In December 1938, in a laboratory in Berlin, chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann were bombarding uranium with neutrons and getting a result that made no sense. They sent their data to a former colleague, physicist Lise Meitner, who had recently fled Nazi Germany. Working through the numbers with her nephew Otto Frisch, she realized what nobody had considered possible. The uranium nucleus wasn't just absorbing the neutron, it was splitting clean in two, releasing an enormous burst of energy in the process. They called it fission. Within months, physicists in multiple countries had worked out the terrifying implication. If a splitting atom released more neutrons than it absorbed, those neutrons could split more atoms, which could split still more. A chain reaction that could, in principle, sustain itself. In 1939, with Europe sliding toward war, Albert Einstein and physicist Leo Szilard signed a letter to President Roosevelt warning that this new physics could plausibly become a weapon, and that German scientists likely understood the same principles already. That letter is often credited with setting in motion everything that followed. By the fall of 1942, physicist Enrico Fermi and his team had a plan to build the first machine capable of a controlled chain reaction, and nowhere obvious to put it. They ended up choosing a squash court underneath the stands of an unused football stadium at the University of Chicago, in the middle of a densely populated city with no containment structure and barely any shielding. Over several weeks, they stacked tens of thousands of graphite blocks by hand into a roughly spherical pile laced with uranium, tall enough to reach the ceiling. On December 2nd, with a small group of scientists watching from a balcony, Fermi ordered the control rods withdrawn a few inches at a time, while the instruments climbed steadily. At 3:25 in the afternoon, the reaction became self-sustaining for the first time in human history. And Fermi let it run for half an hour before shutting it back down. It was part of the Manhattan Project, the wartime effort to build an atomic bomb, and its real purpose was to prove a chain reaction could be controlled well enough to manufacture weapons-grade material. That dual identity, the same physics that could light a city could also level one, has shadowed nuclear power for its entire existence. The bombs came 3 years later. The peaceful use of that same technology came shortly after. In December 1951, an experimental reactor in the Idaho desert lit 4 light bulbs, generating the first electricity ever produced from nuclear fission. In 1953, President Eisenhower gave his Atoms for Peace speech to the United Nations, explicitly framing the technology as something to take out of military hands and put to civilian use. Within a few years, the Soviet Union connected the world's first grid-supplying nuclear plant at Obninsk. Britain opened the first full-scale commercial station at Calder Hall, and the United States followed with its own at Shippingport, Pennsylvania. A technology that had existed only as a wartime secret a decade earlier was suddenly being taught to engineers from dozens of countries at international conferences, its blueprints deliberately declassified. For a moment, nuclear power looked like the future arriving early, clean, abundant, almost too cheap to meter, in the optimistic language of the era. Then came 1973. The OPEC oil embargo quadrupled the price of oil almost overnight. And France, which imported roughly 70% of its energy and had essentially no domestic oil or gas of its own, found itself dangerously exposed. Prime Minister Pierre Mesmer's response in March 1974, was audacious even by the standards of the era. Build dozens of standardized nuclear reactors using the same handful of designs, constructed one after another by the same teams, as fast as French industry could manage. In France, we have no oil, went the slogan of the moment, but we have ideas. Between 1974 and the late 1980s, France commissioned 56 reactors. Today, nuclear supplies roughly 2/3 of the country's electricity, among the highest shares on Earth. The plan bypassed public debate almost entirely, and economically, it overshot demand by the 1980s. But as proof that nuclear power can be deployed fast at national scale, when a country actually commits to it, it has never really been matched. But the story doesn't stay triumphant. On March 28, 1979, a combination of mechanical failure and operator error caused a partial reactor meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. No one died, and the radiation released was minor, but American public support for new nuclear plants dropped by more than 20 points almost overnight and never fully recovered. 7 years later, on April 26, 1986, a flawed reactor design and a botched safety test caused an explosion at the Chernobyl plant in Soviet Ukraine. By far the worst nuclear accident in history. More than 600,000 emergency workers, later known as liquidators, were mobilized to contain the site and decontaminate the surrounding region. Roughly 300,000 residents were permanently relocated, and an exclusion zone around the plant remains largely off-limits nearly 4 decades later. And on March 11, 2011, a massive earthquake and tsunami disabled the cooling systems at the Fukushima Daiichi plant in Japan, triggering meltdowns and the evacuation of over 150,000 people. No one is confirmed to have died from the radiation itself, but the evacuation and its aftermath contributed to over 2,000 deaths from disruption, stress, and the collapse of care for the elderly and hospitalized. 3 accidents in 50 years, 2 of them genuinely catastrophic, and they have shaped public perception of nuclear energy more than every safe, uneventful year of every other plant on the planet combined. That's not irrational. Disasters deserve scrutiny, but it does mean the emotional weight nuclear power carries and its actual measured risk have drifted a long way apart. So it's worth setting the fear aside for a moment and actually counting. Start with the most uncomfortable number. A 2013 NASA-led analysis estimated that nuclear power has already prevented roughly 1.8 million deaths that would otherwise have come from burning fossil fuels instead, even folding in the death tolls from Chernobyl and Fukushima. Nuclear still ends up with the lowest fatalities per unit of energy produced of any major power source. Lower than coal, lower than oil, lower even than rooftop solar, once you count the fatal falls from residential installations. Part of the reason is almost mundane. Nuclear waste is dangerous, but it's solid, contained, and buried deep underground. Fossil fuel waste, by contrast, is gaseous and aerosolized, and we breathe it. Simply by displacing coal and oil, nuclear power has quietly prevented countless cases of lung disease, cancer, and fatal accidents in mining operations that never had to happen. If the choice is between burying a manageable amount of dangerous material in a hole in the ground or pumping an enormous and continuous volume of dangerous material into the air everyone breathes, the first option is the more rational one, even though it doesn't feel that way. That's really the crux of it. Nuclear accidents feel more dangerous than they statistically are, because a single dramatic event burns into public memory, while coal and oil kill gradually and anonymously, one lung at a time. It's the same asymmetry behind why flying feels riskier than driving, despite the numbers saying otherwise, or why the 3 accidents from earlier dominate the conversation about nuclear power. more than the roughly 18,000 cumulative reactor years of quiet, uneventful operation that surround them. And the clock is part of the story too. Even under an optimistic plan, a full transition to 100% renewable energy would take at least 4 decades. For every year fossil fuels remain part of the mix, nuclear keeps saving more lives than it costs. There's a second number worth sitting with, and it has nothing to do with accidents at all: greenhouse gases. Since commercial nuclear power took off in the 1970s, it has kept an estimated 64 gigatons of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. Projections suggest that by the middle of this century, it could prevent an additional 80 to 240 gigatons on top of that. Meanwhile, global energy demand keeps climbing, and it's climbing fastest where coal is cheapest. U.S. government projections suggest China alone will add the equivalent of a new 600 megawatt coal plant roughly every 10 days for a decade, on top of the roughly 4 billion tons of coal it already burns annually. Coal is cheap, abundant, and easy to extract, which means humanity is unlikely to walk away from it voluntarily anytime soon. Given that reality, nuclear energy may be one of the few tools capable of meaningfully slowing catastrophic climate change, while the rest of the transition catches up. It isn't perfectly clean, but relative to what it's actually competing against, it's clean enough. Not a permanent answer maybe, but a genuinely useful bridge for the next century, not just the next decade. And this is where the history actually loops back around. Most of the reactors running today are built on designs frozen sometime around the 1970s, because after 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, serious reactor innovation in much of the world quietly stalled for a generation. Nobody wanted to fund research into a technology the public had just decided to fear. But the ideas didn't disappear, they just sat on shelves. Thorium reactors, for instance, could address the core problems people associate with nuclear power in the first place. Thorium is far more abundant than uranium, much harder to weaponize, and produces up to roughly 100 times less waste that also stays dangerous for a few hundred years instead of several thousand. A single ton of thorium can theoretically produce as much energy as 200 tons of uranium or 3.5 million tons of coal. Small modular reactors are the other half of the shift. Instead of building one enormous, custom-engineered plant over a decade, manufacturers build standardized reactor units in a factory small enough to ship on a truck and assemble them on site in a fraction of the time. Because every unit is identical, the 7th reactor off the line ends up cheaper and faster to build than the first. The same industrial repetition that made France's 1970s build-out work, minus the part where a government had to override public debate to get there. For decades, all of this stayed mostly theoretical. A promising idea nobody was funding. That's changed fast. As of 2026, the nuclear industry is in the middle of what looks like a genuine second wind. And the driver isn't climate policy. It's electricity demand from artificial intelligence and data centers, which need enormous, constant, round-the-clock power that wind and solar alone can't reliably guarantee. Microsoft has signed a deal to restart a reactor at the former 3 Mile Island site, specifically to power AI infrastructure. The very plant, whose name once symbolized public fear of nuclear power, is now being switched back on to feed the next wave of computing. Amazon, Google, and Meta have collectively committed tens of billions of dollars to new and existing nuclear capacity. Small modular reactors are moving from concept to construction in the US, and China's Linglong 1, the world's first commercial small modular reactor, is scheduled to start operating in 2026. More than 40 countries now have active plans to expand nuclear power. It's not really a coincidence that this is happening now. It's what happens when the fear of the last accident finally gets weighed against the cost of not having enough clean, reliable power for what comes next. So, should we keep using nuclear energy? Every large-scale energy source carries risk, and the honest response isn't to default to whichever risk feels most frightening, but to actually weigh the numbers against each other, the way Fermi's team did on a squash court over 80 years ago, and the way a new generation of engineers is doing again right now. Nuclear power really has been two stories all along, one written in physics, careful and quantifiable, and one written in fear, vivid and hard to shake. For most of the last 50 years, the fear has been driving. On the numbers at least, maybe it's time to let the physics take the wheel again.